channel. My name is Ali Usman. I'm a technologist, strategist, and an architect. In this video, we are going to talk about Agile and architecture together. One of the issues that most people struggle with is understanding the role of architecture in the Agile world. And most importantly, how to do it, especially when the other teams are working in the Agile fashion. In this video, I'm not going to discuss why it is important to do that in first place because I feel there's enough literature and material on that already. I will also not be talking about the solution architecture aspect of things, but we'll be focusing on the enterprise architecture. My goal for this video is to help understand how to do enterprise architecture in the Agile world. Before we talk about Agile in the context of architecture, let's talk about the architecture first and how it is commonly used today. I have explained this previously in one of my videos, but we'll briefly touch on it again. Generally, the term architecture refers to a blueprint or a product, but in certain cases, it also refers to the process of creating an architecture. And if we talk about enterprise architecture is the process of understanding and analyzing where we are, where we want to go, why and how do we get there to that state. Architects use different methods and frameworks to perform that analysis and evaluation while creating many artifacts as they go along. Now that we have talked about the process part of the architecture, let's talk about the Agile for a minute and understand what it stands for and what are its origins. The most famous set of principles or values commonly known about Agile came from Agile manifesto, which talks about 4 basic principles: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and the last one is responding to change over following a plan. Before we analyze these principles, you must understand that this manifesto was written by 17 software developers, and the perspective that wrote these principles was basically for software development projects. They did not take into account the higher levels and other forms of architectures. They were focusing on software development practices, and the challenge they were trying to address was a typical waterfall approach, which in the name of risk management technique became an obstacle, resulting in failure of most IT projects. The projects were taking a long time to produce any results. Changes were not easy to make once the product was delivered, and most of the time the product delivered was different than what was originally desired and imagined. To address these challenges, Agile way of working was introduced through Agile manifesto. Now that we have talked about and understood the process aspect of architecture and looked at where Agile came from, let's try to connect the dots. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Before the architecture development work starts, you need to lay down the infrastructure or simply create an environment of collaboration. As an architect, you might not be involved with just one, but many stakeholders. You rely on their external knowledge to be able to accurately develop the architecture. This external knowledge comes from various other resources as well. When you interact with your stakeholders, first thing you must do is communicate the value proposition. I know we were talking about Agile architecture, but your stakeholders need to understand what is that you, your organization, and that stakeholders is getting out of that effort. It is so simple. If there's nothing for them to gain, they will not be fully cooperative and supportive of this effort, regardless of it's Agile or not. You can communicate that value by sharing how the architecture will help solve that problem. Once the stakeholder understands the value add, try to do heavy lift and do the most of the architecture work yourself and by your team, and expose only what needs to be validated through that stakeholders. If possible, create user portal so that the stakeholders can see different artifacts as you produce those. This way, you emphasize on the need and the value rather than confusing them with following certain processes. Working software over comprehensive documentation. As you read this, you can't help but to think about the perspective that this principle was written from, which was the software development perspective. Let's translate that into the EA language and see how can we use this principle for our advantage. After you as an architect has successfully communicated the value, the customer is on your side and is fully supportive of your effort. Now the development work starts. Depending on what artifacts you're producing or nature of the effort, you may want to keep in mind that your artifacts have to convey vision as soon as possible and show a big picture. It may be of limited value in the beginning, but it has to start communicating that vision and the value out as soon as possible. So in other words, instead of building a detailed architecture diagrams and models, focus on high-level version of these and fill in as you go. For instance, build something like that and move towards something like this. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Create an environment of collaboration and trust where different stakeholders can bring their concerns and those concerns can be addressed and discussed. You must bring representation for all the major stakeholders. You will interact with stakeholders across business units and leadership. The leadership has a vision, and you as an enterprise architect are responsible for connecting that vision and the direction of the leadership with the grassroots and help them both understand how and why certain initiatives are offering more value and are in alignment with organizations' objectives and goals. Sometimes you'll get different views. Validate them as soon as possible. You must engage with the stakeholders in such a way where they share with you the problems and especially hear what they are not seeing. Most of the time, they assume a certain solution may solve their problems at hand without giving it a holistic thought, and that's where you come in and bring that perspective into that initiative and that program and connect them with the overall strategy and enterprise's vision and its goals. Responding to a change or following a plan. Typically, the architecture and the agility are seen as in opposites. And a common analogy goes that you cannot live in a room at the same time architecting it or designing it. And I agree with that to some extent. But when it comes to the enterprises, it is not always that we are architecting the enterprises before they came into being. In most cases, the organizations already exist. There are processes, there are procedures, and methods people follow and perform their day-to-day job. Whether those processes are optimal, they're efficient, non-redundant, etc., that is a different question. But enterprises do exist. And just because they exist, so does their architecture. It may be undocumented, brittle, all over the place, whatever you want to call it, but it does exist. And when it comes to responding to a change, your scope determines how quickly you can respond. For instance, while driving a small car, it is far more easier for a driver to respond to a sudden change of road conditions. This might not be as easy for a driver who might be driving a big truck. If possible, try to narrow down the scope, especially those programs or segments where the requirements are not clearly known, so that if something happens, you can respond to those changes accordingly. Now, let's briefly touch on how do I do that. As part of the architecture development, regardless of which framework you're using, you first start with scope. Once the scope is defined, there are different opinions on which approach to choose, whether we start with as-is architecture of the whole organization or start with the target architecture of the whole organization. When it comes down to doing this in an agile way, I propose narrowing down the scope to the project or the program level, which makes it easy to do the as-is and to be both. You must make sure that you understand how this project or program relates to the organization strategy and objectives, how it impacts others, that includes the stakeholders and initiatives. Is it redundant initiative, and why should we do it or not? I have found this approach to be much more safer and agile. Enterprise architecture as a discipline is directly related with the planning aspect of any given organization. By saying that we need to be agile is not an excuse for not doing enough planning. This stands true for the product development as well as the architecture development. This way of narrowing down the scope helps the practitioners do just-in-time analysis and enough planning so that when the development team is engaged, the development and the leadership are on the same page. Today we talked about doing hands-on enterprise architecture in an agile way, and I shared some tips and tricks with you. But E as a discipline brings agility to many other processes as well. That includes software development, portfolio management, and others such as risk management. Thank you for your time. I look forward to see you in the new video. If you like this video, please hit like and share this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps the channel and keeps me motivated. Thank you.